Welcome to the latest in our VX Insight podcast series, designed to help you make the case for meaningful transformation across your business today. So this episode is focused on legacy tech transformation. Now, this isn't a big theme that steals many headlines, and yet it's on the critical path for pretty much all of the major trends that are shaping the industry today. So DLT, T+1, even ESG, all of them have legacy technology on the critical path towards the realization of all of our digitization and transformation. So a few months ago, we set out to understand really the details and the real story behind legacy tech transformation. So working with IHS Markit and with the support of Digital Asset and the Network Forum, we reached out to about 100 organizations to understand exactly how, where and why legacy tech is really impacting their businesses. And so it's a pleasure today to have Richard Wilson from IHS Markit and Tracy Moores from Digital Asset to be able to talk through exactly what we've learned so far and ultimately where the conversation goes. So Richard, Tracy, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, Barney. It's a pleasure to be here.
So just to jump in, before we open with the questions, I would underline that anyone who wants to see the key findings, they are available at www.thevx.io. And we'll be adding more and more resources to that page as we go if you want to keep up on the conversation. So to jump in, so Richie, let's just frame the conversation properly in terms of, how do you define legacy tech in terms of, looking at it from a bank or a broker or an investor's perspective, where does it sit in the priority list today and kind of what's driving that?
I think there's probably a number of things driving it, Barry, from our perspective. Certainly over the last while, what we've seen for a lot of firms that's driving it, to me, there's three main ones. You've got the economic regulation, and then you've also had the pandemic effect, which you're hopefully seeing the back of. I mean, if you look at it from an economic perspective, there's been a lot of cost pressures. You've seen a lot of focus on strategic cost reduction, doubling down on firms now looking at cloud, trying to get the higher levels of efficiency, service standardization. Particularly in industries, it's become very concentrated. So there's been a lot of competition, consolidation, and really, I think trying to apply new tech really is now about delivering new products, trying to exceed client expectations, particularly with a lot of competition out there across from these new fintech firms coming in. Also, if you look at the regs, we've had so many regulations over the last recent years, and certainly they bring their own challenges. We had recently the SRD2 regulation. We've got the CSDR one coming up now at the start of Feb, and now you've got the US T+1. So certainly firms are certainly being impacted. You've got a lot of this reg coming in, just higher capital requirements, there's higher reporting requirements. So certainly investing in the new tech, certainly to comply with those regulations, is going to bring a lot of challenges to the firms, but also introduce a lot of opportunities potentially there for new services. And then the last one I kind of think about is always the pandemic effect. So what that's really done is highlight the importance of technology. Firms have had to kind of learn to function new. It's highlighted a lot of weaknesses and inefficiencies in infrastructure, particularly a lot of the firms. And as you mentioned, we've seen booms now also in ESG securities. Effectively how are people going to be able to manage them? People are looking at those global challenges. And the other one that's kind of catching on too is also the digital assets. So traditional assets and digital assets now being looked at safe, kept in the same environment and the same platform. So certainly there's some of the key things that we're certainly seeing with some of the firms who are dealing with really as people kind of look to see how do they deal with this legacy tech issue.
Yeah, so pretty much everything, really. It's funny. It basically sits underneath everything, doesn't it? Really, as you said, I'm just picturing the board level meeting. In any organisation, and it's pretty much every action point on their list is basically has legacy tech standing behind it. Tracy, from your perspective, obviously from Digital Asset, you guys are at the forefront of kind of driving the change in the next generation. How do you see the legacy piece kind of coming up in firms that you're speaking with?
No, I think it's a great question, and Richard really touched on the key themes that we're also seeing from our side. I guess I would expand on a couple of those. The competitive landscape that you're seeing and the focus on client experience. I think, speaking towards some of maybe the buy side, the cost pressures are real, and they're constantly being pushed by their clients to get new products to market faster. As well as maintaining operational costs. So operational efficiency is certainly driving a lot, and customer experience. I think what a key theme that we're really seeing, and when you think about replacement of technology in the past, was the focus, has traditionally been on how can we lower our costs? How can we help you save money? I think a theme that we're seeing that's growing, that we certainly embrace, is that, you want technology that can lower your costs, decrease risk, but also help you generate new revenues. So we talked about new products to market. So how can that technology help you evolve and differentiate yourself in the marketplace?
Yeah, and I think it's great openings from both of you, really, because I think for me, when I heard the word legacy technologies, exactly as you say, you think about basically cost avoidance and basically throwing old stuff in the bin. You don't really think about actually the customer experience and the revenue facilitation angle, which I really want to come back to later on. So thank you for framing it. So just to walk through, first part of I suppose this conversation is just mapping out where is the legacy technology today, and then we can go through the case for transformation and then what the journey looks like around transformation. But three key stats, I think, for me from our research in terms of where the legacy technology is holding us back today. So first of all, a major imbalance between the buy side and the sell side. So about 27% or up to 27% of sell side systems being older than 20 years old. So some and aging every year. 97% of listed derivative systems still being single asset class. So essentially some very, very acute siloing and legacy technology showing through across the asset class spectrum. And then ultimately across a different access geographically, 84% of broker systems being run either on a local basis and country level or on a regional basis. So, there's a lot of pockets of transformation here. There's a lot of pockets of legacy technology here. And Richard, where do you see across all of those, where do you see the real hotspots in terms of the most acute manifestations of legacy?
I think it's an interesting one, Barney. I think if you look at over the years, focus has always been in the front office. Right now, we're kind of, as we move into what is that back office piece, effectively what people call is the plumbing. And just like, I think the plumbing in your house, most firms don't spend money on post-trade plumbing, really, unless there's a serious problem. A lot of times, I would say budgets are very conservative where possible, but now we're starting to see a lot more interest in those areas, and a lot of that's been driven by the regulation and the changes that's happened, but also, I guess, a lot of the volumes, and they're putting a lot of these older systems certainly under a lot more pressure. If you look at in the corporate action space, you'd have a lot of manual and bespoke systems really which need digitalised, and certainly those reg techs have also put CSTR, put settlement position keeping systems now much more into focus, where really firms need to implement those technology changes, support those regulation changes, and these systems won't be able to support that level of efficiency and volumes in the future, certainly not to meet the level of the client expectations, which Tracy mentioned earlier, which is continuing to grow. A lot of times, I think clients have the expectation that technology should be meeting up with their current needs as they push their iPhone and push their buttons, but unfortunately, financial firms kind of don't really keep up with that as much as people's expectations.
So thanks for that. So Tracy, from your perspective, I mean, again, you're, as you were saying, you've got the whole spectrum of kind of costs, and then future-proofing and client experience, revenue generation. Where across all the industry are you seeing the kind of the absolute the hotspots?
Well, I think when we talk about technology as a whole and the way our industry has been able to grow and evolve with the help of technology, it's actually, I think, starting to become a bit of a burden for some of these institutions, because as you mentioned, you have the single asset systems, you have particular pieces of technology that are only focused on one part of the business. So as you start to expand your technology use, you've now created a problem of disparate systems, very disconnected data models. So ultimately, we're looking for solutions here, and we're technically, creating more problems for the organizations. As Richard said, the plumbing is only getting worse. The front of the house may look beautiful, but I think we need to get back to focusing on the plumbing, really getting these systems, updating your infrastructure to account for multiple uses and getting away from the single use case systems.
Yeah. And just in terms of actually when in both of your conversations with clients, I mean, how would you characterize the kind of the symptoms of legacy tech? I mean, we've covered many areas, and as you said, Richard, people don't spend on post-trade unless they absolutely have to. How is the legacy tech conversation kind of coming through? Is it in a kind of firefighting mode? Are people discussing it? Is it coming through in more of a future planning mode? And ultimately, what are the red flags that people are citing in terms of, what, this is it. This is the end of the road for the system. We've got to move on from here.
I think it's been a bit of a mixture, Barney, to be honest with you. I think some firms are kind of have hit issues around scalability, where the level of volumes over the last number of months, a number of years, really have put them under a lot of pressure, and what that does effectively hinders any competitive advantage or market differentiation that they have. I've certainly seen other surveys where you've seen 51% or a bit more firms were saying that their biggest challenge is really around legacy tech. They just can't scale, they can't meet the volumes, there's just massive cost pressures. And if they're not able really to benefit or utilize any level of standardization to improve their services, they're really going to struggle to compete. So I think there's a big push on that to kind of make sure that the scalability element is there to kind of help them succeed.
Yeah, because both of you, this idea of it really being more of a future-looking conversation rather than a backward-looking conversation is coming through quite clearly. I mean, Tracy, do you find, your point around data models and just ultimately this race that, particularly on the buy side, that people are, fund managers are having to do to ultimately to deliver, cheaper, better products? I mean, how do you find that this is kind of, that legacy is turning up on that critical path in terms of in that race to scalability and things? Are you finding anecdotally people turning up and saying, do you know what, we're just spending way too much time connecting up the data, or spending way too much time managing this or managing that?
I think time and resources are key. And I know we'll get into that, but, time to market. I think if you spoke to anyone on any side of the business and they're finding ways of replacing legacy technology, how can they do that in the most time and cost-effective manner? I think many of these projects that people want to engage in, once they get it all on paper, it looks to be a 2-3 year project. And I think that that in itself is a risk as technology continues to evolve. So, we are seeing, we like to say, we know this is a revolution in terms of technology, but this needs to be an evolutionary move where you start replacing and start working piece by piece where you can get value today versus looking at an entire rip and replace in the future.
Yeah. And just thinking about that then, the time to market, the revenue facilitation, the client experience, if we were having this conversation 5-10 years ago, do you think it would have been meaningfully different in terms of the drivers that people were facing then and now?
I think the reliance on third-party vendor technology 5 years ago and that outsourcing model, I think, was what consumed a lot of approach to technology and replacing that. I think some today would argue that maybe that got a little too ahead of itself, and we talked about the multiple duplicative systems that people have deployed over time. So I think the difference today is you're seeing a little bit more that firms are trying to bring a little bit more in-house to maybe get that competitive advantage, their own secret sauce on it, and again bring, and we talked about their own version of client experience to their technology systems.
Absolutely, yeah. Richie, do you think we've moved on much in terms of how we describe and how we see the legacy problem in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think we have, Barney, to be honest. I think a lot of firms now are much more open towards the newer technologies and the next gen, solutions that are really coming in place. I think 5 years ago, certainly from our experience, a lot of firms would have been very much into having applications maybe on site or in-house, where now you're seeing, the cloud. The cloud is just, it's a given now, where people are kind of looking to reduce that total cost of ownership, effectively having, managed services, having outsourcing, certainly to various different vendors. So I think the concepts have certainly moved forward, and I think firms are certainly looking for a lot more now. They're looking for much more component-based, more systems that can effectively integrate easier with each other through APIs, etc. So I certainly think the landscape has changed, and firms are certainly much more open to newer technologies.
Yeah, it's very interesting, really, that this, Tracy, your point about insourcing ultimately is increased the focus on your technology platform is really interesting, kind of, and the idea that now that the kind of the menu of options is much bigger than it was. Ultimately, it's meaningfully different from me if we were having this conversation several years ago. So then, in terms of what do we do about it? So the case for change, if we've talked about basically that the inputs to this discussion are manyfold in terms of revenue facilitation, client experience, all the way through to the good old cost management. What's fueling the cost for change based on the research, as far as we can tell, is interestingly, it reconciles entirely with what you're saying. It's not system end of life. So we're not dealing with legacy because basically it has to go in the bin. We're dealing with it either because, as you said, Richie, regulations, cost, risk management, those are all the major drivers that are fueling the business case today. But really echoing your point, for me, its standout stat is that the average, P&L of a legacy transformation project is about $1.5 million, of which about 45% is new revenue facilitation. So, for me, it's part of this whole discussion. It's very critical to remind ourselves that it's not about costs. It's not just about shutting down. It's about growth and facilitating time to market, new assets, new growth, as you've been saying. But ultimately, on the challenges that we have to address in the business case, resourcing stands out as being the biggest problem. So, Tracy, you touched on it. How do you resource up a multi-year project? Basically, just how do you get this stuff done in an era where obviously our return on investment timeframes are quite short? Especially over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of firefighting. So 13% of respondents citing resourcing as being the biggest challenge. So in the context of all of that, when you guys think of the business cases, and you're obviously intricately involved in those transformation discussions, what are the trigger points that are making people cross the line, if you like, in terms of taking something from like the frog boiling in water, taking them from, yes, this is a problem, to, yes, this is something we're actually going to do about it? Richie, have you got a view there?
Yeah, I think certainly from our perspective, again, right, I think operational efficiency is a key. People really are looking to achieve that SDP as much as possible. Certainly I've seen particularly during the pandemic, there's been a lot of inefficiency around any paper-based process, around proxy voting, account opening, and that was all amplified during the pandemic. Firms really, they tried to pivot, and certainly they've adjusted, but some of that stuff has been temporary, and it's not really sustainable long-term processes. So I think they definitely need to move off those more tactical solutions that they've put in place. Also then, as I mentioned, going back to the reg, and it's just so prevalent at the moment. Firms need to look at that kind of a holistic approach to how they're going to deal with best practices across the middle and back office. A lot of times you need to simplify and rationalize these systems in light of what these global regulations are doing. It's different if it's more jurisdictional. You can probably look at putting in a service in place, but certainly for the larger, industry-wide regulations, you certainly need to have that right approach. And then the other ones I kind of see as a trigger, like I mentioned, ESG and digital assets. Digital assets really is an interesting one that we're seeing. Firms really need to understand now how they're going to, join up the dots there, how they're effectively going to be able to manage custody from a safekeeping perspective for digital assets alongside traditional assets. How are all these systems going to be able to intertwine and talk to each other, particularly from an API perspective, and how do you go to market with a solution like that?
Yeah, absolutely. What are you seeing, Tracy, on that in terms of the triggers that are getting these business cases funded?
Yeah, I think many of those same key themes. I guess I would highlight regulatory is always I think at the top. In the past, where have we seen those transformational changes in technology? They're driven by regulatory change, market infrastructure change. Something we're seeing coming down the pipe is, as you mentioned, a T+1 potential. So certainly that gets the attention of, of these operational efficiency executives and how those systems could potentially handle something like that. I think I would go back to an original point that I said, where we think about new revenue. So there is that healthy competition amongst market participants. So if market participant A is innovating and launching new products via new technology, I think others take notice. And as that gains steam, and as you see some adoption growing in the market, I think that fear of falling too far behind also is a trigger for them to maybe reallocate some resources and prioritize that.
Yeah, it's so interesting that ultimately the narrative that comes through from what you're saying is ultimately, a lot of people talk about, as I said, legacy as being, okay, we've got a COBOL system that we need to throw in the bin or whatever, but ultimately, really what we're saying is that the catalysts for change are basically all the kind of the straws that break the camel's back. That, that ultimately it's the suddenly that a crypto asset's turning up in the portfolio, that ESG data now has to be a prism through which we see everything, or as you said, that basically that your peers have run ahead and you need to keep up. All of those are kind of things that ultimately you're only as good as any of those could land tomorrow, is what I'm thinking about. And so there's a real future-proofing case that ultimately if we'd gone back, even 3-4 years and said, right, huge numbers of portfolios are going to include a digital asset, ultimately very few people would have said, well, that means we've got to change now. And suddenly, on a dime, we're all having to face that. So for me, there's a really interesting conversation here around basically the fact that you're only as good as tomorrow's problem kind of thing. To your point, do you think that we are, when we're having these conversations and we're taking these investment proposals for approval in terms of getting the spend, do you think that the conversations are centered on the whole P&L, the end-to-end P&L sufficiently? Because we're saying really that there's a massive revenue piece in this, and the stats basically say that, as I said, more than 40% of the P&L of the project is revenue facilitation. Do you feel that comes through adequately in conversations today?
I think it all comes down to really an institution's appetite for change and the capacity to change, Barney. I think you've got a cultural aspect and you've got a financial aspect. And a lot of times do firms have the staff and the talent to implement such programs. So, a lot of these programs require skill to manage, a prioritization and going on that journey, because I think a lot of times these transformations or legacy tech changes, they really are a marathon, not a sprint. Oftentimes internal costs for any of these digital programs could easily be 2 to 3 times the cost of implementing a new solution from a vendor, because there's a lot of internal stuff that needs to be kind of sorted, be it from retiring systems, integration, development, etc., to support a new vendor. So I never underestimate that. I think there's it's certainly a long journey, and I think there needs to be a very good, strong talent pool within any firm that's kind of starting that journey to kind of get involved and they bring forward their legacy technology.
Yeah, and look, that frames up the next part perfectly. So the whole question, as you're leading on to, really of managing and executing on the change. For me, the stats from the research that came out really clearly is that basically everyone is looking at this. So 83% of firms that that we spoke to are either planning or executing projects in 2022, 2023. So pretty much a significant minority of people are not actually making a major change in this area. And where that change is happening ultimately is in the equity space and predominantly in the corporate action space. So 48% of firms in the equity space are actually replacing their legacy tech right now. But that ultimately there's a big red flag in here, which comes back to, I think, many of the dependencies that you were just highlighting. This whole idea of incremental versus transformative change. It's about 50-50 between basically getting in a real system, driving real change that's actually going to do more than just fix the last problem. But half the market's still basically looking at just adding a new data layer, or adding a bit here and there, and kind of just basically getting past CSDR or getting past digital assets and surviving kind of thing. So for me, there's a real question about, as I said, transformation versus kind of tinkering. So, how do you see that playing out? Richie, you mentioned, that the tip of the iceberg piece, that you've got 2/3 of the cost being the kind of, to the cost of essentially the organization being ready to execute, and then about 1/3 of the cost being the vendor solution, just picking rough numbers. I mean, how do you find that impacts people's ability to change, and then ultimately, and then the change that they're actually up for in terms of their ambition?
I think a lot of times, Barney, it comes down to really having clarity of business case of what you're trying to achieve. A lot of times I think the firms probably underestimate the level of change that's involved. You really need to understand the scope, the landscape of a change program really before they frame it. I think the survey really highlighted 3 main ones, which is reg, risk and data. But to me, I'd also add into there, talent, having experience and having the know-how to implement such a program. Having the will and the desire to change is one thing. Having the ability to implement it and deliver on it is a completely different thing. A lot of time that comes down to having the experience and having that staff and that talent to be able to do such a program.
Yeah. What's to be done on that? Just out of interest. I mean, from a talent perspective, if what we're saying is part of the problem is that, you don't really know these things until they suddenly hit you. It means that basically you've got to be grooming your talent well in advance, and you've got to be writing and framing your business cases well in advance of the next big thing hitting you. How does that actually show up in a firm, just in terms of best practice, if you like?
I think it's about having change management programs in place. There's no easy way, I think, for it to show up in a firm. I think firms have got to have the focus and have got to be always forward thinking. Certainly ones that stand still inevitably will get left behind. I mean, the rate and the change in technology today is unprecedented. I mean, we've seen the pandemic, which I go back to refer to, we've seen changes in firms over the last 2 years that probably traditionally would have taken 5-10 years to actually happen. So I think being on that journey now, I think it started with the pandemic, but I think now people are much more open to understanding the technologies that are out there. People are much more technology aware. So I think you just have to embrace it and kind of start to see it as a positive thing to help the firms move forward.
I think your point about change management as a fundamental discipline, as a BAU, I think for me is that's such a core piece that ultimately, as I said, it's not a question of survival. It's about embedding change management as a core function within the organisation, just to deal with the constant level of change that we're facing. That really resonates for me. And I mean, Tracy, from your perspective, you're on the transformational end of this very much, from a digital asset perspective, in terms of restructuring not only the way we work, but the mindset we bring to that. How do you find the whole incremental versus transformational change piece, in terms of when you're speaking to people, what's pulling them forward across that line from tinkering to transformation?
Yeah, I think to double down a bit on Richard's point, on certainly firms need to have those resources. They need to be, forward thinking, but how those, I think from a change management perspective, how that organization is thinking. And I'll give you a client, anecdote. I think some of the clients that we've seen that have embraced this change, that have really hired talented people, or at least started to cultivate that culture within, they can begin and commit, I think, to these transformational changes. And through our experience and what we're seeing, those particular large customers that embrace it, that hire and really move things forward, it's actually proven a direct result for shorter time to market, accelerated projects for many of their peers across the industry. So it is a cultural change, but I think many organizations that have embraced that culture, others that are now starting that movement, can really leverage a lot of the lessons learned from those that have really moved with a proper plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the linkage between legacy tech and legacy transformation and the cultural change that you guys are talking about, in terms of actually bedding in certain talent pools into the organization as a necessary first step. I personally, I don't feel that necessarily comes through enough in people's organizations. As I said, it's too easy to just deal with the latest challenge and not really take the bigger cultural change piece into account. But if we look at the overall market, I mean, there are different speeds of legacy transformation based on different pressures that we've talked about in terms of growth, so on and so forth. The survey highlighted equities, and particularly the corporate action space, as being a real standout. Does that resonate with you? And I suppose, Richie, from your perspective, what's behind that in terms of what makes that space so uniquely suited to what we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think corporate actions has always been a hot topic. I think, Barney, particularly over the last 10, 15 years. I think traditionally you could see a lot of operational teams need to manage it through the wonderful world of Excel or a lot of manual touch points. And I think what's happened is that now effectively people are looking to automate both from an announcement capture perspective and certainly the downstream processing. And again, there's multiple options out there around, from a announcement capture perspective and managing clean messages. You can have managed services effectively. You can outsource and get very clean data from and multiple vendors. But I think it's been such a manual process. There's so many manual touch points in it that certainly a lot of firms now are looking to reduce the risk around it, reduce the complexity. Some of the events are very, very highly complex and need a lot of manpower on it. So I think corporate actions is one that's always been to the front of the fore in the last few years, that people have probably not had the investment initially on it, but certainly now they're seeing it as such a risk area that they want to get it down to a highly streamlined and highly effective process going forward.
Tracy, from your perspective, just thinking about what we opened with in terms of where the biggest areas of challenge are, we talked about local systems, regional systems, siloed asset classes. What do you feel we're overlooking? Are there any areas where you feel that that we continue with a risk, in terms of some of the silos that we talked about at the beginning that aren't being dealt with?
I think siloed systems are certainly a risk to a company's technology infrastructure. I think we're, as an industry, we're only going to try to increase the products that we're getting out to clients, as you've well noted on the evolution of the digital products. So I think siloed systems, we can't continue to just put an additional system within our infrastructure. So how do we, I think Richard mentioned this, how do we work on better integrations? How do we kind of bring these technologies to handle new issuances? But I would go back to the corporate actions. I think it's something we certainly see a lot, but I think you can take the scenario around what's pushing corporate actions and apply it to other parts of the organization, because really it's the risk around human capital and a focus on even Excel spreadsheets in a process. The pandemic certainly brought to the forefront that people need to be able to work within a much more sophisticated, integrated system across organizations without that human capital risk. So, those are really single siloed systems, and I think, having too much, because certainly these corporate action teams are fantastic. They're very good at what they do, but I think there is that risk of the human capital. There is an area that we can bring together technology and the oversight of these very experienced people to make that significantly de-risk a system like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so I suppose on the negative side, let's think fast forward. We were saying the conversation would have been very different 5-10 years ago. Fast forward 5 years. Why and where is legacy just going to carry on surviving? I mean, there's many reasons that are helping us to push across the threshold. Why are certain areas of legacy technology just going to hang on, do you think, Richard?
I think it's an interesting one, Barry. Ultimately, there's still lots of legacy systems out there. You can see that from the survey. I think they survive because a lot of tactical solutions, effectively sticking plasters, are put in place, and also they have a lot of support by experienced staff. But I'll be honest, I don't think that's sustainable, certainly not in the long term. At some stage, those plasters will need to come off, and there's going to be a major issue there. I think, you need to have that level of continuity planning. You need to have system upgrades rather than these minimum efforts to keep systems running. You need to have sound practice. But I think in order for firms really to move and move forward from that, they need the right people, they need talent. I know we went back to that point earlier, but that's what's going to be needed to help these systems and these firms move forward, because that experienced staff that they've been relying on for the last 10, 15, 20 years, effectively those people are going to retire, and there's going to be a serious problem within some of these institutions and how to support those platforms.
I mean, it does feel like, we are loosely, we are starting to get to the point where, the burden is untenable almost, as you say. We can't carry on as we have. Tracy, does that resonate from your perspective? I mean, do you feel that ultimately that you fast forward 5 years and that, the tolerance for legacy is so diminished that ultimately we really are going to do something about it? Or do you think certain parts will kind of resist the change?
Yeah, I think certain parts will continue to resist the change. Do nothing is the biggest risk, I think, for these organizations. And it, unfortunately, sometimes it takes an event to force that change, whether it's global pandemic, whether it's a change in regulatory, initiatives. But I think, to Richard's point, hiring and at least managing the staff, like you said, that's been working the same system and they will retire. I think bringing in the innovation and start to cultivate that culture will help organizations identify the areas to prioritize over time. Because I don't think, we've touched on that, to run out and try to play catch up on some of these things is not the best business model. But creating that culture to replace things over time the right way with the right future technologies is what companies will need to do.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. So thank you for that, because I think the idea it takes an event to force the change really resonates. The key is that ultimately, if we can get ahead of that, then ultimately, as you said, we're not going to find ourselves on the back foot and struggling to keep up. So the last question then for both of you really is okay, so how do we wrap all this together? If you are sitting there with somebody who's kind of running an operation of varying degrees, what are the 3-4 steps that we need to be taking from a kind of standing start to feeling like we've really got this one down in terms of managing the legacy tech agenda? Richie, have you got a view there?
Yeah, I think regularly, Barney, I think there's probably a number of points that they need to be kind of looking at regularly. I mean, you need to be assessing your tech stack. Is it fit for purpose? I mean, it's a really obvious thing to say. You need to be looking at what percentage of your tech spend is keeping the lights on rather than investing in new systems. You need to be very abreast of what's happening in the industry, like, what systems are available that best serve your needs. Are you implementing the right systems that can potentially save you money in the long term, particularly if there's possible options around managed services out there. You could have providers that effectively are adding new features that could enhance your business without you being aware of it. And then I think you need to be planning for the future. Is it better to continue to invest small amounts in latest technology rather than having a system issue that you can't service clients in the future? I think ultimately then those 3 steps, it's almost rinse and repeat every year. You need to continually refresh this and be on top of it and keep looking at it to see where you're positioned from a technology point of view, because the one thing about technology is it's not slowing down. And if anything, it's going to pick up further over the next few years as newer technologies come on stream.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that rinse and repeat piece really stands out for me. The idea that it's not you don't just have a look and then realize that you're comfortable. It's this constant questioning and constant recycling of the question. Absolutely. Tracy, from your perspective, what do you think has really stood out as key success drivers for the projects that you've seen?
I think, to be proactive rather than reactive. I think, this industry at times has been resistant to change. I think over the years, technology has proven to be very helpful to organizations, and I think they need to continue to innovate, continue to hire, and be proactive on evaluating, what is important to their business, and therefore prioritizing that technology spend with that. I think seeing organizations not necessarily take a crazy risk, but to step out and test the market with new products and new innovations. I think that's where, we will take those steps. But, having the staff, having the talent within your organization to support that and be effective with that is going to be key going forward.
Brilliant. No, look, thank you for that. Because I think for me, the consistent theme of everything we've talked about is that, I think, as I said at the beginning, to oversimplify, legacy technology historically has just been a kind of firefighting job that is very, very tactical. But what we're saying is that there's a much more fundamental and constant approach that needs to be taken to this. I think that the proactive versus reactive, keeping up with industry solutions, and ultimately just constantly building and maintaining the talent pool that's going to facilitate all of this. They're all, I don't think, factors that automatically come into the whole legacy tech conversation. So thank you very, very much for drawing it all together as cleanly as you have. So as I said at the beginning, anyone who wants to be able to download the key findings, they're available at vx.io. But Richie, Tracy, thank you so much for running through this. I'm sure anyone who wants to be able to reach out will be pinging you with questions about how to manage the next legacy problem that they've got and how to make the most of it. So thank you.
Thanks, Barney.
Thank you.